The regret of nothing came out of the fold 3 hours late, venting atmosphere from a hull breach that should not have existed, and Fleet Marshal Tovin Ashari stood on the observation deck of Naval Command Station Ilthera and counted the transponder signatures as they resolved on the plot. He counted 12. He counted them again, because a man who has commanded punitive fleets for 31 years does not trust a number the first time it insults him. 12. He looked at the manifest scrolling beside the tactical display. 40 hulls had left this station 4 months ago, painted in the clean grey and gold of the 6th Correctional Flotilla, provisioned for what the briefing packet had called, without irony, a demonstration of proportionate consequence. 40 ships to remind one insubordinate colony world that the Empire's patience was a courtesy, not a right. 12 ships had come home, and something about the way they were coming home, the regret of nothing trailing atmosphere like a wounded animal trailing blood, running dark on every channel except the one broadcasting a docking request in a voice that did not sound like the Fleet Marshal remembered voices sounding, told him that the missing 28 were not the worst part of what had happened out there. He was wrong about very little in his career. He was wrong about that. The station's reception protocol for a returning correctional flotilla was ordinarily a small ceremony. Honor guard at the primary dock, a junior administrator with a data slate ready to log commendations, a handful of family members permitted dockside for the crews whose postings allowed it. Ashari cancelled all of it within the first 10 minutes of watching the 12 ships limp into formation. Not because protocol required it, but because some instinct older than 31 years of service told him that whatever these ships were bringing home did not belong in front of an honor guard or a data slate or anyone's family. He gave the order to clear the primary dock and reroute the flotilla to a restricted berth normally reserved for classified salvage, and stood alone at the observation window afterward, watching the regret of nothing grow larger against the black, its running lights flickering in a rhythm no maintenance manual would have called normal, and found that his hands, folded behind his back in the posture he had held through 6 previous corrections, without once needing to think about it, were not quite steady. 4 months earlier, the precipitating incident had been, on paper, almost administratively boring. A survey drone laid down 11 centuries prior by the Empire's 3rd expansion had drifted into a dead orbit around a yellow star in an unremarkable arm of the galaxy, and its dormant claim beacon, silent, unpowered, indistinguishable from debris, had never transmitted a single byte of its sovereignty declaration to anyone because its power cell had failed 9 centuries before humans figured out how to smelt iron. Humanity found the system on its own, named it, mapped it, and over 11 years quietly turned a marginal rock in its outer belt into Kepler Anchorage, a mining and fabrication colony of 40,000 people who built water reclamation plants and hydroponic decks, and a school with hand-painted murals of earth animals none of the children had ever seen, because none of them had ever left the system they were born in. When an Imperial cartography vessel finally reactivated the beacon's Dead Man archive during a routine resurvey and discovered the claim had never lapsed, only gone silent, the Empire did not see a colony. It saw an unauthorized occupation of sovereign territory, and worse, an occupation that had been permitted to entrench itself for over a decade without so much as a courtesy filing. The formal notice that followed was, by Imperial standards, almost gentle. A correction order giving Kepler Anchorage 18 months to submit to inventory, taxation, and administrative absorption, or to relocate at its own expense. Humanity's response, drafted by a colonial council that had never in its short existence dealt with an interstellar bureaucracy and did not fully grasp what it was refusing, was 3 paragraphs long. It acknowledged the notice. It disputed the claim's validity on grounds of abandonment. It noted that Kepler Anchorage would continue operating pending review, as its water and power systems could not be safely mothballed on short notice, and formally requested arbitration. Then the Colonial Council kept building. Not out of defiance, out of the simple, mundane fact that 40,000 people cannot stop eating, breathing, and repairing hab seals just because a letter arrived. To Kepler Anchorage, this was bureaucracy. To the Empire, it was insubordination performed in real time. in full view of 11 other border systems who were watching to see what happened to a species that ignored a correction order. That was the part that mattered back on Ilthera. Not the rock, not the 40,000 people on it, the precedent. Fleet Marshal Ashari's superior, Grand Administrator Belneth Kaur, had said it plainly in the briefing that sent the 6th Correctional Flotilla out. We are not going to war with an anthill. We are going to remind 11 watching border systems that the Empire's patience has a shape, and this is what happens when a species mistakes silence for permission. 40 ships. A demonstration. Incorrect out. In time for the autumn assizes. Fleet Marshal Ashari had led 6 such corrections in his career. He expected this one to be the easiest. There was in the Empire's internal politics another layer to the calculation that never appeared in the mission briefing, but shaped every decision Ashari made once the flotilla was underway. Grand Administrator Belneth Kaur had staked no small amount of personal capital on the 6th Correctional Flotilla succeeding quickly and cleanly. Kaur had been the one to argue against a faction on the Assizes Council that favored slower, more expensive full military annexation of border systems, that a light punitive fleet could enforce compliance faster and cheaper than a standing occupation force, that a demonstration, properly executed, would do the work of 10 garrisons. If the 6th Flotilla returned having spent months and dozens of ships subduing 40,000 unarmed miners, Kaur's entire doctrine of proportionate correction would be finished, and with it, quite possibly, Kaur's seat on the council. Ashari understood, without anyone saying it plainly, that failure here would not simply be a professional disappointment. It would be a career-ending embarrassment passed down the chain from Kaur to himself, to every officer who had signed onto this fleet, believing it would be the easy one, the one you volunteered for to pad a service record rather than risk one. That pressure was why the flotilla had been given 40 ships for what should have needed 10, and why Ashari had accepted that number without argument. More ships meant a faster, more overwhelming demonstration. More ships also meant, he would understand only much later, a larger and more devastating number to report as lost. Captain Orsa Ilundi did not expect that, and she had said so once in the pre-departure briefing, in the flat voice of a woman who had spent 19 years learning that saying things once was usually all the career room she had. "Sir," she'd said, "the colony reactivated an Empire-issue claim beacon's dead archive and still kept building. That's not defiance. Defiance would have been shutting down and lawyering up. That's people who don't think the notice applies to them, because in their heads nobody owns that rock but them. We're not walking into a garrison that knows it's beaten. We're walking into a town that doesn't know it's supposed to lose." Ashari had thanked her for the perspective, filed it, and briefed the flotilla exactly as planned, because 31 years of successful corrections is a hard thing to argue against with a hunch. Political officer Reth Calvane, riding the flagship to ensure ideological discipline and after-action reporting, had been less generous. "Captain Ilundi's caution is noted and will be reflected in her file," he'd said, in the particular tone imperial political officers used when they meant, "I will remember this." Ilundi commanded the heavy cruiser, 3rd Correction, 3rd in a line of ships all named some variation of the same idea, and she had learned over 2 decades of watching the Empire discipline systems that displeased it, that the ones who said something once and then obeyed anyway were the ones who survived to be right later, quietly, to people who mattered even less than she did. She had come up through the ranks on the strength of exactly that instinct, cultivated since her 2nd posting, when a younger, less careful version of herself had argued loudly and repeatedly against a commanding officer's plan to bombard a rebellious mining guild into submission, and had watched that same commanding officer succeed brilliantly, be decorated for it, and go on to a governorship, while Ilundi spent 4 years flying cargo escorts before anyone trusted her with a bridge again. She had drawn the obvious lesson from it, not that she had been wrong, but that being right too loudly, too early, cost more than the Empire would ever repay, and had spent the 2 decades since folding her disagreements into single, precise sentences delivered exactly once, then obeying without visible resentment, because visible resentment was the one thing a career like hers could not survive. Kepler Anchorage was the first posting in 19 years where she had broken that rule, and she would spend the transit home turning over, again and again, the question of what exactly had changed in her, whether it was the sabotaged ports and the sewage-flooded corridors, or the 11-year-old murals of animals she had seen once on a recovered data drone, painted by children who had never left the system they were born in, or simply the accumulated weight of 2 decades finally exceeding what one more silence could hold. She was right sooner than she wanted to be. The first contact, 90 minutes after the flotilla dropped out of fold at the system's edge, went wrong in a way that did not match any doctrine written for a correction. Imperial procedure called for a show of force at the outer marker, 3 cruisers peeling off to establish a picket, the rest holding formation while a diplomatic drone broadcast final terms toward the inhabited rock. It was designed to be seen and feared, not fought. Kepler Anchorage had no navy. It had, according to every survey, 6 unarmed system traffic tugs and a scattering of mining barges with all the offensive capability of a wrench. What it had, that the survey had not accounted for, was every one of those tugs and barges retrofitted over 4 months by 40,000 engineers, miners, and hydroponics technicians who had decided individually and then collectively, without any formal declaration anyone could point to, that they were not moving. The picket cruiser. Second correction took a mining laser, a tool designed to crack asteroid regolith at close range, never intended as a weapon, entirely unlisted in any threat database the Empire owned, through its unshielded sensor array from a barge that its targeting systems had classified, right up until the moment of impact, as non-combatant, no response required. The laser wasn't strong enough to breach the hull. It didn't need to be. It blinded the cruiser's entire forward sensor suite in one pass, and in the 11 seconds it took the crew to reroute to backup optics, 4 more mining lasers converged from 4 more non-combatant vessels that had spent 4 months quietly synchronizing their firing solutions over a jury-rigged data relay built from parts scavenged out of the colony's own communications array. The second correction did not explode. It simply stopped being able to see, and in the 2 minutes that followed, 3 tugs latched magnetic grapples to its hull and began, methodically, with the calm horror of people who had drilled this 100 times in simulation, venting its coolant lines into vacuum through access ports, never designed to be reached from the outside, because the tugs had been built to service exactly those ports for exactly that class of hull back when the Empire's own maintenance contracts were still active in the system. Fleet Marshal Ashari, watching from the flagship, understood in that moment that the colony had spent 4 months studying his ships, not preparing to flee them. He pulled the picket back. He reformed the flotilla into a standard suppression sphere, the doctrine answer to any surprise resistance, overwhelming, patient, methodical, designed to close a system down system by system until nothing moved that hadn't been cleared to. It was the correct response. It was also, Captain Ilundi noted quietly to her XO, exactly the response 40,000 engineers with 4 months and nothing to do but plan would have expected, because it was the only response the Empire had. The pattern that emerged over the next 6 days did not look like a battle. It looked like an infestation. Ships that came close enough to board found airlocks that had been remachined to accept non-standard seals, venting attackers into vacuum on breach rather than opening cleanly. Shuttles sent to secure the colony's water processing plant, a soft target, civilian infrastructure, easy leverage, found the plant's automated systems had been reprogrammed to flood boarding corridors with reclaimed wastewater under enough pressure to break bones, a use of civilian plumbing that no Imperial engineer would have conceived of, because no Imperial engineer had ever needed to weaponize a sewage main. A frigate assigned to interdict fuel shipments discovered that Kepler Anchorage's remaining ore haulers had begun flying in patterns that made no tactical sense by any Imperial simulation, until 3 of them detonated their own reactors in proximity fusing, a maneuver that killed their own crews and had clearly been decided, discussed, and volunteered for by people who understood exactly what they were choosing and chose it anyway. That was the moment Reth Calvane began using the word fanatics in his reports, and the moment Ashari began to suspect that word was doing more to comfort the Empire than to describe what was actually happening 300,000 kilometers below his flagship. By the 6th day, the 6th Correctional Flotilla had lost 7 ships and had not fired a single weapon designed for war. Every loss had come from something improvised, repurposed, or volunteered. Tools turned to violence by people who had built the tools in the first place and knew every seam and weakness the Empire's own engineers had left in decades-old designs, because those designs had been Imperial exports, sold to this very colony back when it was still a customer instead of a target. The pattern that troubled Ashari most was not the losses themselves, but their variety. A destroyer assigned to sever the colony's long-range communications array lost half its crew to a decompression trap built into an old relay housing. A maintenance access point the array's own Imperial installation manual had specified, repurposed by colony engineers who had simply read the manual the Empire itself had left behind and asked what else the design allowed for. A supply tender, sent to interdict food shipments between the colony's outlying agricultural domes, was lured into a debris field that Imperial charts listed as natural drift and colony survey logs, quietly falsified over the preceding month, listed the same way. It was neither. Every fragment in that field had been shaped and positioned by hand in slow, patient EVA work carried out under the flotilla's own sensor coverage, disguised as routine maintenance traffic. The Empire's own occupation notices had explicitly permitted to continue during the review period. The tender's hull was opened in 11 places. Before its crew understood, they had flown into a minefield built from their own rules of engagement. None of it, Ashari noted grimly in his private log, was sophisticated by Imperial standards. None of it required technology the colony did not already possess. What it required was 4 months, 40,000 people willing to spend that time preparing instead of packing, and a complete absence of anyone in command telling them it was hopeless. That last part unsettled him more than any weapon could have. An Imperial crew facing hopeless odds waited for orders. This colony, facing worse odds than any Imperial crew he had commanded, had simply kept working. "They are not fighting us with a fleet," Ilundi said in the command conference that followed, to a room that had stopped disagreeing with her 3 days earlier. "They're fighting us with familiarity. Every ship we lost to something they built out of parts we sold them, doing a job it was never designed for, because somebody down there looked at what they had and asked what it could become instead of what it was for. We don't have a doctrine for an enemy that redesigns its own toothbrush into a knife between breakfast and lunch." The crisis of command came on the 9th day in the flagship's war room, and it was not subtle. Reth Calvain argued for immediate, total bombardment, orbital strikes on every population center, doctrine be damned, on the grounds that a correction that could not correct had, by Imperial law, escalated automatically into a pacification which permitted lethal force without further review. "They have killed Imperial citizens with reclaimed sewage," he said. "They detonated their own reactors rather than submit to boarding. This is not a people who can be corrected. This is a people who must be removed." Ashari did not answer immediately, and in the silence Captain Ilundi spoke, because 19 years of saying things once had finally run out. "Political Officer Calvain wants to burn the surface because the people down there won't stop being clever," she said. "I'd like the room to sit with that for 1 moment before we vote on it. We came here to demonstrate a consequence severe enough that 11 other border systems would never test us. If we glass 40,000 civilians because 6 unarmed mining tugs embarrassed our censor doctrine, every system watching won't learn that the Empire is patient and terrible. They'll learn that the Empire panics the moment it's inconvenienced. That is a worse precedent than the one we came to prevent." "The captain," Calvain said, "is welcome to author a minority position for the record." "I am," Ilundi said. "I'll also point out that we have not, in 9 days, made contact with a single armed combatant. We have fought infrastructure. We have fought plumbing, mining tools, and ore haulers. We have not found their military, because as far as I can tell, they don't have one. They have 40,000 engineers who decided, together, apparently without a single order any of our intercepts have found, that they would rather die than move. That's not an army we're fighting, political officer. That's a decision made individually 40,000 times, and I do not know what weapon burns that away, because it isn't in any of them. It's in all of them." Calvain did not yield easily. He reminded the room twice that Imperial law defined a pacification threshold specifically to remove ambiguity from moments like this one, and that ambiguity was precisely what a fleet marshal without the stomach for a hard decision would hide behind. He reminded Ashari more quietly that the Grand Administrator's political fortunes rode on this fleet returning with a clean story to tell, and that a clean story required an ending decisive enough that no one on the Assizes Council would ask uncomfortable questions about how 28 Imperial warships had been lost to a colony with no navy. A clean story, Ilundi said before Ashari could answer, is not the same thing as a true one, political officer, and I'd remind this room that the 11 border systems this whole exercise was meant to impress are not stupid. They will hear about the sewage main and the mining lasers and the manual welding no matter what word we put in the after-action report. The only thing left for us to decide is whether they also hear that we answered 40,000 unarmed civilians with a full bombardment. I don't think that story frightens anyone into obedience. I think it tells every one of those 11 systems exactly how much resistance it actually takes to make the Empire lose its nerve, and I do not want to be the officer whose name is on the order that taught them that lesson for free. The room was quiet after that in a way it had not been quiet before, and Ashari made the call that ended the debate. And it was not the call Calvane wanted, and it was not fully the call Ilundi wanted either. The compromise of a man trying to hold two truths that could not be reconciled. Full bombardment was denied. A concentrated ground and orbital assault on the colony's primary habitat ring was authorized instead, framed as a final demonstration. Break the colony's capacity to resist, take the Council into custody, and let the survivors carry the lesson home to the 11 watching systems without erasing the lesson's audience entirely. It was on the record restraint. It would not feel like restraint to anyone on the ground. Mara Voss had been a structural engineer for 11 years before she became, without any election or ceremony, the person 40,000 people looked to when the sky started doing things it wasn't supposed to do. She had not asked for this. Nobody had asked for it. That was, she thought later, the strangest and most human part of the whole 4 months. There had been no vote, no council decree assigning her authority, just a slow accretion of people bringing her problems, because she was the one who, on the second day after the correction order arrived, had said out loud in a crowded ration hall, "We're not leaving, so let's figure out what not leaving is going to require of us," and then had actually started figuring it out instead of going home to be afraid in private. By the time the flotilla arrived, Kepler Anchorage had built something that had no name in any military manual, because it wasn't a military. It was every engineer, every hydroponics tech, every ore hauler pilot and school teacher and water plant operator doing the thing they already knew how to do, aimed sideways at a problem none of them had trained for. Voss's genius, if it was genius, and she would never once in the whole ordeal call it that herself, was refusing to centralize any of it. There was no single command structure the Empire could decapitate, because there was no single command structure at all. There were 40,000 people who had spent 4 months talking to each other, arguing, revising, building on each other's half-finished ideas in shared workspaces that looked, to an outside observer, like chaos, and functioned in practice like a nervous system with no single brain and 40,000 reflexes. The cost of it arrived on the 9th day, when Imperial dropships began landing Marines on the outskirts of the habitat ring's western agricultural dome, and orbital fire started walking a line of destruction toward the school with the hand-painted mural of animals none of the children had ever seen. Dane Okafor, who'd been a system traffic controller and was now, by the same accidental accretion of trust that had made Voss the colony's unelected voice, coordinating the scattered improvised defense of the ring itself, made the call to divert every remaining tug and hauler to draw the orbital fire away from the school and toward the empty processing yards instead. It worked. The school stood. 41 people who had been staffing the diversion did not, and among them was Okafor's older brother, who had volunteered for the run because Dane could not fly it himself, and someone had to, and there had been no time to argue about who. The ground assault itself lasted 6 hours, and felt to the Marines who fought through it nothing like the pacification exercises their training had prepared them for. Imperial doctrine for suppressing civilian resistance assumed panic, disorganization, and eventually surrender once a population understood the cost of continued defiance. What the Marines found instead, moving dome to dome through the Western agricultural ring, was coordination without a command structure they could identify and target. A squad that breached a hydroponics dome, expecting to find civilians sheltering, found instead a rotating schedule, posted on a wall in handwritten marker, showing which residents were assigned to plumbing sabotage, which to first aid, which to simply keeping the crop systems running, so there would be food for whoever survived the day, as though the defense of the colony and the maintenance of ordinary life had never been treated as separate problems at all, but as two entries on the same list. A Marine sergeant named Costigan Vray, whose after-action report would later become required reading across 3 subsequent Imperial campaigns for reasons that had nothing to do with the tactics he described, wrote of the moment his squad cornered 11 colonists in a maintenance corridor with no possible avenue of escape. He had expected surrender. Instead, 3 of the 11 detonated compressed gas canisters they had been carrying, not as weapons aimed outward, but sealed into a service duct behind his squad, collapsing the corridor and trapping his own unit on the wrong side of the dome for 4 hours, while the remaining 8 colonists slipped out through a maintenance crawlway and vanished into the tunnels beneath the ring. Vray's report noted with a kind of professional bewilderment that read almost like admiration, that none of the 11 had appeared to be soldiers, that they had clearly rehearsed the maneuver, and that not one of them had looked at his squad with anything resembling hatred, only the calm, unhurried focus of people finishing a task they had already decided upon days before his boots ever touched their floor. It was in the wreckage of that same maintenance corridor, 4 hours later, that Imperial forces recovered the only 3 combatants taken alive in the entire ground engagement, a mining technician and 2 of her apprentices, found unconscious in a collapsed service alcove after an EVA sabotage run against the picket line had gone wrong, and stranded them without enough suit reserves to reach any shelter on their own. They had survived only because 2 other members of their team, already critically injured, had bled their own suits' remaining oxygen into the technicians' reserves by hand before losing consciousness themselves and dying in the vacuum they had chosen not to leave. When Imperial medics reached them, both donor suits were found sealed shut from the inside, valves manually locked open toward their crewmates and closed toward themselves, a detail that made its way into more than one internal Imperial memorandum in the weeks that followed, unremarked upon in the official record, impossible to forget in private. Voss found Dane afterward in the corridor outside the aid station, not crying, just sitting very still with his hands open on his knees, like he'd forgotten what they were for. "We're going to lose," he said. It wasn't despair. It was arithmetic, said out loud by a man good at numbers. Probably, Voss said, because lying to him would have been its own kind of cruelty. But losing and moving aren't the same thing. We agreed on that in the ration hall 4 months ago. Has that changed? It hadn't. That was the part the Empire's simulations had never modeled. Not that humans wouldn't break, but that breaking and surrendering on Kepler anchorage had stopped being the same event somewhere in those 4 months of ration hall arguments. The colony kept fighting not because it believed it would win, but because the people in it had, individually and collectively, decided that the alternative, quietly boarding relocation transports and letting the claim beacon's dead archive dictate whether their children's murals meant anything, was a worse loss than dying in the dome they'd built. The largest engagement came on the 11th day, and it decided in the end how many ships would leave orbit at all. Ashari committed the flotilla's full remaining strength to a coordinated strike, meant to end the fight in a single stroke, simultaneous orbital bombardment of the ring's power core, a marine assault on the Council's operations center, and a picket to prevent any further improvised sabotage from the colony's remaining vessels. It was, on paper, overwhelming. 33 ships against 6 unarmed haulers and whatever 40,000 civilians could throw together, with hand tools and desperation. What the plan did not account for, could not have accounted for because it required a kind of coordination. Imperial doctrine did not believe civilians capable of was that Voss's decentralized, leaderless network of engineers had spent 11 days doing nothing but studying the flotilla's response patterns, and had learned something about Imperial command structure that no intelligence briefing had ever told them. Every major Imperial maneuver required confirmation, cascading down through at least 4 layers of rank before execution, a doctrine built for stability and discipline in a war against other rigid hierarchical fleets, and utterly unsuited to an enemy who could redesign a plan in the time it took a lieutenant to relay a question up the chain and wait for an answer. When the bombardment began, it walked exactly the path Imperial doctrine dictated. Methodical, sector by sector, predictable within a margin the colony's engineers had mapped to the second. The power core had already been evacuated and rerouted to a decoy shell 3 days earlier, built from salvaged reactor housing and enough residual radiological signature to read as active on every Imperial sensor. The Marine assault on the operations center found it empty except for note, left by Voss herself, that Reth Calvane would later read aloud in a debrief with a fury that surprised even him. "There's no center. That was never how this worked. Go home." The picket meant to prevent sabotage held for 6 hours against nothing because the colony had no more vessels left to sabotage with. Every hauler, every tug, every ship capable of flight had already been spent in the 11 days prior, burned in maneuvers that killed their crews to buy hours, not victories. What broke the picket in the end was not a weapon. It was 300 people in vacuum-rated mining suits, launched from a maintenance airlock on manual thruster packs never designed for combat, who crossed open space under fire and manually welded the picket cruiser. 4th Correction's primary docking clamps shut from the outside, stranding its entire boarding complement mid-transfer between 2 ships, neither of which could now separate, while a second team disabled its point defense grid by hand, port by port, in EVA suits, using tools built for hull maintenance on ships the Empire itself had once serviced in this very system. 211 of the 300 died doing it. The 4th Correction drifted, crippled and boarded by its own stranded crew for the rest of the engagement. It was the moment Ashari finally understood what Ilundi had been trying to tell him on the first day. This was not resistance calibrated to survive. This was resistance calibrated to cost the Empire more than the Empire had budgeted for winning, delivered by people who had done the arithmetic on their own lives and found the exchange rate acceptable. He gave the order to withdraw 4 hours later, with the habitat ring's western half in ruins, the school still standing, the colony's population reduced by a number no one aboard the flagship would ever say out loud in his presence, and 28 Imperial ships destroyed, disabled, or too crippled to make the fold home. The withdrawal was not a victory lap for either side, and the 12 ships that formed up for the fold home carried that fact in every readout Ashari reviewed in the hours before departure. The regret of nothing had lost its coolant systems to the same class of exterior sabotage that crippled the 4th Correction, and would spend the entire transit home venting atmosphere from a hull the engineering crews did not have the parts to properly seal, because every spare bulkhead panel aboard had already been cannibalized to patch worse damage elsewhere. The flagship itself carried, in its brig, the only 3 Kepler anchorage combatants taken alive in the entire engagement, not captured in glory, but found unconscious and starved of oxygen, in the wreckage of a EVA team that had run out of suit reserves 40 minutes before rescue, kept alive only because 2 of their crewmates had transferred their remaining air to them by hand in vacuum and died doing it. What the 12 ships carried home, though, was not primarily physical. Ashari understood that in the 3rd week of the transit, sitting in on a routine crew evaluation that his ship's surgeon had insisted on after 2 junior officers on the 3rd Correction had refused quietly and without incident to complete a mandatory after-action report, characterizing the colony as hostile insurgents. They had not mutinied. They had not argued. They had simply written, in the space provided, that they did not believe the term fit, and left it at that, and Captain Ilundi had not disciplined them for it, and had said so plainly when Calvane demanded she should. They watched 40,000 civilians burn their own reactor housing empty as a decoy, and weld a warship shut from the outside with mining tools rather than let us finish what we started. Ilundi told him, in a conversation Ashari was not meant to overhear, but did. "You can call that insurgency in a report. My crew watched it happen from a range close enough to see faces on the exterior monitors. They're not going to unsee what they saw, because a form has a word count." It was not only the junior officers. In the second week of transit, the Regret of Nothing's chief engineer, a 30-year veteran named Paul Ashenvar, who had spent his entire career believing implicitly in the Empire's right to correct whatever it decided needed correcting, requested a private audience with Ashari that the Fleet Marshal had not expected and did not afterward forget. Ashenvar had spent the battle's final days keeping his ship's failing coolant systems alive through 6 separate near-catastrophic leaks, working 18-hour shifts beside the very kind of jury-rigged, improvised fixes that the colony below had used to kill his crewmates. He told Ashari, without preamble, that he had begun to notice something he could not stop noticing. Every emergency patch he devised to keep his own ship breathing used the same logic, the same willingness to repurpose a tool beyond its intended function that the colony's engineers had used to cripple half the flotilla. "I kept my ship alive the same way they kept killing us," he said. "I don't know what to do with that, sir. I don't think it means what the political officers' reports say it means. I think it means they were doing what any of us would do if it were our home and someone told us we didn't have the right to decide who lived on it." Ashari had no answer for him beyond a nod and a dismissal, and had lain awake afterward, turning the engineer's words over the way he imagined Ilundi had been turning over her own doubts for 19 years before she'd finally let one slip in front of a political officer who would never forgive her for it. That was the contagion Calvane had no framework for, and it was not sabotage, and it was not a weapon in any sense his doctrine recognized. It was doubt, moving crew to crew across a fleet that had spent 31 years trusting that the Empire's authority to correct was simply a fact of the universe, the way gravity was a fact, and had now watched that authority fail to bend a single unarmed colony that had never once asked to be corrected in the first place. The doubt did not look like rebellion. It looked like officers who filed reports with careful, exact language instead of the words their superiors expected. It looked like a surgeon who requested crew evaluations nobody had ordered. It looked like Captain Orsa Ilundi, 19 years disciplined into saying things once, now saying them as many times as it took, because she had watched something on Kepler anchorage that made the cost of silence feel, for the first time in her career, higher than the cost of being remembered as difficult. Ashari did not know, standing on the observation deck of Ilthera Station and counting 12 transponders where 40 had once been listed, whether that doubt would spread further once these ships docked and their crews dispersed into the wider fleet, into the wider empire, telling and retelling what they had seen to people who had not been there and would have to decide, on nothing but a stranger's word, whether to believe it. He suspected it would. He suspected that was precisely why the return of 12 ships, quietly carrying that story in 300 separate mouths across 3 surviving crews, would trouble the Grand Administrator far more than the clean, deniable loss of all 40 would have. 28 ships gone was a tragedy that could be classified, mourned in the abstract, and folded into next year's procurement budget as an argument for better hulls. 12 ships home, carrying crews who had stopped believing the word correction meant what the Empire needed it to mean, was a rot with no procurement line, no budget fix, and no doctrine written anywhere in the Empire's 11,000-year archive for how to unteach 30,000 witnesses what they had watched a species without a navy do rather than kneel. On Kepler anchorage 6 months later, Mara Voss stood in the rebuilt ration hall, smaller now, quieter, with too many names on the wall behind her and not enough hands left to finish the murals in the new school before winter, and did not give a speech, because nobody had asked her to be the kind of leader who gave speeches, and she had never wanted to be. She read the names instead, all of them. It took 40 minutes and nobody left, and when she reached the last one, her own brother's name, third from the bottom, killed in the second week, manually disabling a point defense grid in a suit 2 sizes too large because the right size had already been given to someone else. She did not pause any longer on it than she had on any of the others, because that too had been agreed in a hall much like this one 4 months before any of it started, that no death here would be worth more than any other death here, and that the only thing any of them owed the Empire or history or each other was the truth of what it had cost, said plainly, out loud, together. Dane Okafor stood near the back, arms crossed, watching the room instead of her, the way he'd taken to doing since his brother's funeral. When she finished, he was the one who spoke, into the silence that followed, not because anyone had appointed him to, but because somebody always did in this place, when silence had gone on long enough to need breaking. "They'll come back," he said. "Bigger next time, or they won't, and they'll just leave us alone because we cost too much to be worth the correcting. I don't know which. Nobody down here knows which. But I know we're not moving, and I know that's the only thing we actually decided back at the start, and everything since has just been us finding out what that decision was going to cost." Voss looked at the names on the wall a moment longer, then folded the list and set it down. "That's the whole thing, isn't it?" she said. "They came here to teach us we didn't have the right to say no. We're still here. That's the only lesson that ever mattered. And it's the one thing they can't unteach us now, no matter how many ships they send." Nobody clapped. Nobody cheered. It was not that kind of room, and it had not been that kind of war. But the murals went up in the new school that winter anyway, earth animals none of the children would ever see, painted by hands that had spent the year before welding hull breaches and carrying the wounded. Because some things, once decided, simply continued, the way a colony continues, the way a doubt continues, the way a story continues, in the mouths of 12 crews who came home changed, and could not entirely explain, even to themselves, what it was they had actually survived. 3 months after that, a single unarmed Imperial courier vessel arrived at the edge of the system, broadcasting nothing but a standard diplomatic hail and a formal request for arbitration under the very appeals process Kepler Anchorage's council had invoked, unread and unanswered, a year before. Voss did not know, and would never fully know, how much of that courier's presence traced back to Grand Administrator Kor's ruined credibility on the Assize's council, or to a report Captain Orsa Ilundi had filed under her own name, rather than the sanitized language Calvain had demanded, or to the quiet, unmeasurable weight of 300 crew members across 12 ships who had gone home, and in bars and mess halls and letters to families in a dozen systems, told a version of events that no ministry could fully unsay. She only knew that the courier's request was, for the first time since the beacon's dead archive had first spoken, addressed to Kepler Anchorage as though it was something the Empire had to negotiate with rather than something it could simply instruct. She did not think it meant the Empire had learned to see them as equals. She thought, standing on the observation deck of the colony's rebuilt communications tower and watching the courier's tiny transponder blink at the edge of the system, that it meant something smaller and more durable than that somewhere in the Empire's vast, patient bureaucracy, a very old assumption had finally acquired a cost, and costs, once paid, tend to be remembered long after the reasons for paying them have been folded into someone else's report. "Answer it," she told the communications officer beside her, "and tell them we're still here. They already know that part. Tell them we're the ones who get to decide what happens next."